Hi and welcome back to Philosophy with Phil, with me, Phil Cohen. For this video, I want to talk about Shabbos. We've got this coming weekend, this coming Shabbos is the Shabbos project in this country, in the UK. We're calling it Shabbos UK. But I thought it's a great opportunity to talk about this wonderful, wonderful day. Shabbos commemorates God's completion of creation. It's the point at which he stopped. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But Judaism is all about emulating God. We have a tradition that God keeps the Torah. And so we likewise try to be like God. And so just as God stopped his creation on the seventh day, stopped doing creative work on the seventh day, so too we stop our creative work for that one day. The number 7 has come up a few times in previous videos. We talked about it with the videos on the human psyche, where we talked about 7 in connection with the female dynamic. And I'm not saying that this is all women are like this, but I'm saying that it's the sort of power of femininity that we see in the deeper sources, in Jewish theology anyway. And that power is the power of incubation and contemplation and consolidation, versus the male aspect, which is that initial spark and that initial ignition. And that's very much what Shabbos is about: consolidation and contemplation on what we've achieved over the past week. We've also talked about 7 in terms of Sukkos. And comparing it with Pesach, saying that whereas Sukkot and Pesach both being mandated as 7-day festivals, outside of Israel we celebrate them as 8-day festivals, but in Israel, in the Torah certainly, they're mandated as 7-day festivals. And whereas Sukkot represents the sanctity in space, we sit in the sukkah, the space of the sukkah, Pesach is sanctity in time. And the timing of Pesach very much fixes the rest of the Jewish calendar. Well, similarly, Shabbos is also a sanctity in time. In fact, Pesach is called in the Torah, is called Shabbos in the Torah. It's interesting to note that Shabbos, the week, is one of the few units in time that isn't a natural occurrence. Days are based on the sun, and so are years. Months are based on the moon, but a week has no sort of natural astronomical measurement. It's something purely designated by God and by the Torah. So as I say, to keep Shabbos, we celebrate Shabbos by not doing creative work. And I want to talk about those two things. Firstly, we'll talk about what we mean by malacha, which is what the Torah term is for the work that we don't do on Shabbos. And then we'll talk about the idea of restraint. So the Torah talks about not doing what we call malacha. And as you may be aware, the word malacha is very loosely translated as being work, but that's not really a fair translation. Simply lighting a match or switching on a light switch is forbidden on Shabbos. Whereas in many cases one can go for a walk. If you're living within an Erev, you can carry heavy goods. You can do things that would ordinarily be called work, but are totally permitted on Shabbos. Shabbos is the point at which God stopped creating. He could have carried on ad infinitum. So to give an example, God created wheat. Now if he had carried on creating, it would have turned into bread. But he stopped at that point, and from that point onwards, man takes over and creates and turns the natural resources, turns the wheat into bread. In fact, the blessing we say over bread is hamotzi lechem min haaretz, that God brings bread forth from the ground. Well, bread doesn't grow in the ground, wheat grows in the ground. But it's because of that creative aspect that God is a partner in that journey, in that process, that we commemorate that through the blessing. So Shabbos represents that sort of touch point between where God's interaction with control of nature it ceases and his creative powers cease, and he so to speak, it's very difficult to explain this in sort of human terms, but it sort of goes into sort of maintenance terms, if you like, and it's man's creative powers takes over, and it's man that sort of takes the wheat apart and turns it into bread and pounds it and kneads it and does all the baking and stuff to make it into bread. In fact, we define what malacha is in terms of activities that were involved in building the tabernacle in the wilderness. The tabernacle was a mini temple, a portable temple that the Jews carried around with them in the desert whilst they travelled. And according to the deeper sources, the construction of the temple, the tabernacle, very much mirrored God's creation of the world. In fact, Bezalel, the chief architect of the tabernacle, was someone who the Zohar says was capable of, had new secrets of Kabbalah that was able to create that God used in creating the world. Creation, it's interesting to note that creation starts with pure light. And then it moves towards sort of more physical things like land and earth and plants. And then moves back into more spiritual things again, ultimately ending in the creation of man. It's a bit like a menorah. If you see the shape, the two sort of spiritual ends at either side, sort of culminating in the middle. And we see that with, incidentally, we see that with Shabbos as well. Shabbos kind of draws its light from the two ends of the week. There are different opinions. Some say that it's the 6 days of the week that lead into Shabbos. Others say, from a mahalachic stance, that the 3 days either side of Shabbos sort of feed into it. For example, we can see that the first act you can do to celebrate Shabbos is to wish someone good Shabbos. Well, the first time you're allowed to do that during the week is on a Wednesday. The last thing you do on Shabbos is to make Havdalah. And the last time you can do that for Shabbos is on a Tuesday. So we see the days sort of between Tuesday and Wednesday sort of leading into Shabbos, and Shabbos sort of illuminating those days, three either side of it. We say that in Kiddush that God, and quoting from the Exodus 20, chapter 24, that God Shabbos v'nafash, that he rested and he was v'nafash, he was revitalized, I guess. The beauty of the Hebrew language is that we use nouns as verbs, and nafash is from the Hebrew word for soul, nefesh, the lowest part of the soul. And God was in some way re-spiritualized. And what we mean by that is that God's physical activities, physical interactions with the world became more and more withdrawn. And so he was able to, again, difficult to explain, but able to sort of consolidate again in terms of spirituality. So if you like, that dilution that he had to make to be able to create the world and to interact with the physical world became less and less physical and more towards the spiritual again. And so that he was able to, again, control the world, continue in the sort of maintenance function of controlling the world. And we do believe that God controls the world on every single molecule, every single subatomic particle, and every force and everything like that, but he was able to do that without the creative aspects that we then took over from. So we said that Shabbos is about celebrating not doing creative work, not doing malacha. I wanted to talk about this idea of restraint. Restraint, if we look at the laws of Shabbos, there are 39. How do we celebrate Shabbos? Well, there are two ways of describing it. There's one positive mitzvah that we have, which is Kiddush, to make Kiddush. But there are 39 things that we're not allowed to do, as I say, based on the activities involved in constructing the tabernacle. Interesting to note, by the way, that when we talk about construction of the tabernacle, we said earlier about the contrast between sanctity in time versus sanctity in space, and that the tabernacle and Sukkot represent sanctity in space, whereas Pesach and Shabbos represent sanctity in time. It's interesting to note that we can't do the things that are involved in creating the sanctity in space. We can't do the things that are involved in making the tabernacle on Shabbos. The one precludes the other. So the 39, but there are 39 things that we're not allowed to do, and people often find this difficult to take on board. We celebrate Shabbos by not doing things. It's almost like we're creating an empty a blank canvas. We're creating an empty space and saying, well, this is the space within which we're going to operate for these 25 hours or whatever it is for the day of Shabbos. But that's exactly what the Jewish concept of Kedusha is. And we often call Shabbos Kodesh. In fact, the word Kodesh first appears in the Torah in relation to Shabbos. So we see there must be a connection there. Kedusha is about separation, is about blocking off. The marriage ceremony is called Kiddushin because one of the very first things we do is to preclude the bride from marrying anyone else. That's the first step. Then we're able to sort of have the wedding ceremony. Okay. So Kedusha is about restraint. I've talked about Kedusha in terms of marriage. The Sedra of Kedoshim, the Torah portion that we read, which is named after Kedusha, is one of the main themes of is forbidden marriages. People were not allowed to marry. Again, creating that sort of space by building boundaries, by creating walls, and then we fill that space. Well, what do we fill it with? Another concept that's closely associated with Shabbos, and that appears for the first time in the Torah in relation to Shabbos, and that is bracha. And we say that God, and we learn in the Torah that God blessed the Shabbos. In Lechot Dodi, we talk about Shabbos being the source of bracha, of blessing. And it's that time where we can switch off from us being us, and we can just bask in that bracha that God gives by being Vayenofash, as he was refreshed. So Shabbos is very much a time to switch on. It's not a time to switch off. Okay? And yeah, I know that people have the custom to have a shluff, go to sleep on Shabbos. But it's very much about being spiritually refreshed. We don't sit in a darkened room and meditate on Shabbos. There are some Hasidim, there are some sects that do, okay, on a Friday night, and they have their whole thing for doing it. But on the whole, the idea of Shabbos is Oneg Shabbos, is to celebrate Shabbos. And all the razzmatazz and the pandemonium that goes alongside with that. I will end with just one little anecdote. And it's from a fabulous rabbi, Reb Yomin Levine. He was the grandson of Reb Ari Levine. And if you've read a book called Tzaddik in Our Time, he was a tremendous tzaddik. He was the mashgiach of Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, various other prominent posts. He was constantly mixing, this grandson was constantly mixing with great Rabbonim who would frequently stay in their house and spend Shabbos with them. And he said, you would think that with these Rabbonim there would be, singing Zemiras and great Divrei Torahs and bashing around all sorts of great Torah thoughts and discussions and meditations and high spiritual elevations that only, us mere mortals are not worthy of being able to comprehend. What he says is exactly the opposite. He said those Shabbos tables were just like any other Shabbos table. They were full of kids throwing stuff around and spilling stuff and going over what they'd learnt in school that week and talking about things that would only interest a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. And he said that's what Shabbos is about. You can try and prepare and have all these lofty thoughts that you want to relate to your children or you relate to the rest of the family. but actually it's about coming together, and it's about being together as a family, and sharing the experience of Shabbos. And yes, that can be messy, but hey, life's a bit like that. So again, Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for watching.